The following presentation represents current thinking with J Schools and our J County Health Department about the reopening of the schools. This information was shared with the J School Board of Trustees on June 15th, 2020. The purpose here is to be conversational, to speak directly to our families and community, to walk them through where we've been, where we're at, and where we're going as we reopen our schools. There are hyperlinks in this presentation to other content. These slides themselves will be put on the J Schools website on Tuesday, June 16th, along with a parent survey to gain more input and communication with our families. Where we've been a month ago, nearly, we had a school board meeting where we talked about the reopening of schools through an advisory to start getting ahead of this challenge and not waiting until it was too late to plan adequately and communicate adequately. So this presentation here, June 15th, is a testimony to our commitment to engage with our parents and keep everyone informed. We updated our community on May 18th, and since then, we've surveyed our parents. We're going to talk about the results of that survey here through this presentation. We also formed that advisory and began working with the parents, teachers, and employees that formed that advisory. And then June 5th, just 10 days ago, we received guidance from the Department of Education in concert with the other state agencies on considerations for reopening schools in Indiana. And I included that link to that document as well as a recorded version of the live stream pursuant to that document that was produced by the Department of Education. So here's where we're going. June 15th marks the community and school board update to communicate the work of the advisory. It's for information as we keep everyone informed. Obviously, we included in the presentation the link to the Department's of Education's presentation as well. What we're sharing tonight is our analysis of how to reopen schools and share the results of the survey on May 22nd that parents provided us. Also, in the meeting on June 15th's board meeting, we had representatives of the J County Health Department who were present to answer questions from the board, and they have been with and involved in this process since May. We will also resurvey parents with this new information. It's fair to point out in the survey we conducted in May, that was a point in time. None of us had much information. We have more now. We want to make sure we're staying close with our parents as we move through this together. Our timeline anticipates a decision by the board to reopen schools by July 20th. So that's the decision date at that school board meeting. We'll know more information in a month. We will have matured plans. We will have seen what the COVID impacts in our county are as we move to July 20th. We'll also anticipate refined guidance from the state. So we're not going to wait to the last minute to deal with this, but we also recognize, and we all do, the environment's very fluid, and what health guidance changes, the virus changes, its effects and impacts change. So we recognize that July 20th is the decision point with refined information, and it's about the last opportunity we have to make the call. The only action item from the June 15th meeting was to authorize the reopening of our summer activities, because we recognize that those are authorized to begin by the state July 6th, and that's ahead of the July 20th meeting. So at least for our summer programs, authorization from the board and the health department was obtained. What you'll note here is a primary planning assumption that we will be going back to school on August 12th on time. This is predicated on the assumption of a low community spread. So we'll talk about what that means in a moment. But our primary planning assumption and the work we are engaged in is focused on reopening the schools at 100% on August 12th with health mitigations, which again, this presentation will bring out. We are now shifting any thought to a delayed reopening as a contingency only. That is, if for some reason we had to experience a moderate spread in the community, we've at least planned for a contingency of September 2nd start with 50% occupancy, and we'll describe that as well. But I want to make sure that everyone understands that's contingency only, and our primary effort and planning is focused on an August 12th start on time at 100% with health mitigations, as we'll describe. So the readvisory itself has been very important, and it's met a number of times. It includes 8 parents, 10 community members, 25 teachers and employees and administrators representing all levels. And key to this was involvement from the beginning with our health department. So a broad base of people, thoughtful people that have worked together to bring us to this point in the process. Our focus is on providing our board of trustees options while engaging our parents, employees, and the community continuously, which is evidenced in this presentation, past and future surveys. We are focused on reopening our schools while mitigating risk, maximizing the amount of time students are physically in schools while we balance local health official recommendations. We recognize and did in May and continue to that we must provide an online option to meet the needs of families, and we will. And we prepare for contingencies for a 50% occupation where students attend every other day. This is a very common model being considered by school districts around the country. In our case, it's a contingency only, and prudent planning for that contingency is ongoing. And we know that we must be flexible in our plans because conditions on the ground in our county will dictate what options are most feasible at a moment in time. So very flexible planning. We based this planning on medical advice from our health department, the facts about the COVID impact in our county. We also recognized the plans must be realistic and feasible. And thirdly, we have to acknowledge that these plans must be acceptable to parents. So that's the three-part way we looked at this. So what did we learn from the state? June 5th of 2020, we did receive guidance on reopening schools. It's important to point out that was a full month ahead of when we thought we would get that guidance. So earlier coverage of our governor's comments indicated in May that we might not receive guidance until July. This was a very important point when we determined that we should consider a Labor Day start. We have received that guidance a month ahead of what was originally forecasted. I think this significantly changes our view of a Labor Day start. The Labor Day contingency was based on not getting guidance until July, which would not have allowed us enough time to prepare. The fact that we've gotten it earlier has now pushed any consideration for a Labor Day start further out in our considerations. So again, reiterating primary planning assumptions, start on time. We also learned that there will be no decision statewide on when and how schools reopen. This will be left to local communities to determine, primarily school boards with the advice of health departments. The authority to close schools rests with our health departments with advice from our school districts. So that's how that decision-making authority looks. And we learned from the state guidance that as we look at this pandemic and the reopening of schools, the school's ability to maintain a safe and healthy school environment is critical, and the prevalence of COVID-19 in our communities is a very important point. Counties will look different. And we added a third. That item 3 is important to us, and that is our parents in the community have to be willing to accept what is done, and that's locally defined. So what do we learn from you as parents from our survey on May 22nd? We learned that a majority of you want to go back to school. There were a lot of undecideds, and probably in that red about 7 to 8%, although it doesn't list it here due to the graphic. 7 to 8% are in that no category. A lot of folks on the fence, and a majority want to go back. It's fair to point out that out of those nearly 1,300 responses, that was a point in time in May. None of us knew much. We know more now, which is why we're going to survey again. It was clear to us, and I think we've seen this in a lot of communities that are now surveyed, that we have a lot of folks who will not wear masks, even if it's mandated. They will not send their students back if masks are mandated. So that was the question, and that was the response. And our responses were very similar to Ohio's survey. There were 14,000 responses to the Ohio Parent Teacher Organization survey, and they were at 40% no return if masks are mandated. So we're pretty consistent on that. And that's an important point on what the community will accept, what parents will accept. That data speaks of a significant a split. So we did ask that question: if we did have to go back at half or 50% occupation of the schools on an every other day basis, what would it look like? And the survey data was, again, about that 7 to 9% no, which is consistent with the earlier slide, 2 slides previous. But a lot of folks would take that online option. It's fair to point out that this was in May, and not a lot of things were known. But certainly at that time, a month ago, a lot of folks on the fence, waiting for more information, and that's what we're providing. Our county is like a lot of rural counties, has childcare challenges. So if we did have to go back at 50%, which every other day, which is not our focus right now, then we know that's going to present obstacles, not just for our county, but for a lot. So 66% said they would not have issues with childcare, but that leaves an awful large chunk that would. And that weighs heavily on the disruption of returning in a blended or hybrid model every other day at 50% presents. So we wanted to make sure we're actually paying attention to what are the effects of COVID-19 in our county. And that's primarily in the lane of our health department. So when we did look at the data, we examined as of June 10th, which is the as of date for this data, where we're at. So 59 cases, 623 tested. I want to point out that, as it's been also reported a lot in the press, covering medical experts, that the virus itself has minimal impacts or lesser impacts on youth as opposed to previous pandemics. So we're looking at 3.4%. It comes down to roughly 2 cases in this age group. So it's certainly not reflective of the majority of those who get it demographically. So we peeled back and asked the health department, peel this back a little deeper for us so we can see what are the actual impacts on COVID-19 on our population. So for Jay County, 14% of those 59 cases were hospitalized, 2% were ventilated, 86% of cases non-hospitalization, and a recovery and release from isolation at 85%. So with this is a rolling set of numbers. So at this moment, we've still got people in isolation, but all the data trends towards recovery. And at this time, there's 0 deaths in Jay County associated with COVID-19. So the reason this data in this particular slide are important is we have to weigh the actual impacts of this virus in our community against or in balance with the effects of closing the schools or reducing our students attending every other day. That will have significant impacts if we were forced into that on our kids' education, and then on disruption to families, on childcare, on their ability to manage this. So this is why we are looking at 100% return. Our assessment of the actual impacts of the COVID virus currently are low in the county. And when you weigh that against the disruption of not returning to school at 100%, we assess that we ought to return to school at 100% based on this data. So this is a graphic that we used that describes this. So low spread school reopening is our primary focus and option. And we assess that the impacts of the community spread of the virus and its effects on our population are currently low. And as a result of that, we're focused on a traditional reentry at 100%. Now, in a moment, as we walk through this with you, that doesn't mean we just all of a sudden come back as if there's no COVID-19. It's still here. So we have to mitigate the spread of that with the tools in our toolkit. And we'll talk about what that will look like. So what does it look like? We're opening at 100% with mitigations really comes down to these 8 points. Defining self-screening. We need to make sure that if people are sick, they don't come to school. If there are employees that are sick, they don't come to work. So we have to prevent the illness from getting inside the buildings to the best of our ability. And we need to provide options for those who cannot attend until they can. So that self-screening is going to be talked about in subsequent slides on what are the symptoms, what to look for, educating parents, kids, and employees on this is the symptoms that you should not come to school when you have. And we'll talk about when you can in subsequent slides based on advice from our health department. There's been a lot of talk about temperature screening and these touchless laser temperature screenings of kids at school bus stops or in the building. We've been advised by health officials in the Parkview medical system that is an ineffective technique, given the fact that many folks are not symptomatic when they have it. And two, it's not feasible for a school district to do 100% in our county for our school district. The mere logistics of lining up 3,100 students every day and screening them will create conditions for spread worse than we would if we just let them in. So the strategy here is self-screening. And it's the ability for every family and every employee to know what the symptoms are and know not to go to school and know what to do when you can't and how you can come back. We'll talk about that. Hygiene's important. Hand washing, a lot of hand washing, a lot of hand sanitizer, including on the buses in the morning, in classrooms, in common areas. Promoting hygiene is important. A lot of things you're seeing here are pretty well known to us. We've seen countless media coverage, countless guidance from CDC. By now, I think we all know that hygiene is important. So as disinfecting surfaces, we'll be increasing our cleaning in buses, classroom, common areas, and high-touch surfaces. It's been important to note that the CDC guidance has indicated that the transmission rates of surfaces are far less than other means of spreading virus. That doesn't mean we're not going to clean. We're going to clean more, and we have all the procedures, processes, and supplies to begin that. The next one is keeping kids in cohort groups as much as possible. So what does that mean? It means keeping groups of kids together where we can. So easier at the elementary levels, a little harder at the secondary levels. We all know what school looks like. When we were in elementary, we pretty much stayed with our class. When we went to the junior, senior high, we started moving. So examples of cohorting would be assigned seats in a classroom, assigned seats on school buses. It means rotating with my class of kids. If I'm a kid going through recess, I go with to recess as a part of a class, and creating schedules to allow for that. So why is that important? If there are cases of COVID that happen in the school or to a student or a person, the health department through the state of Indiana's health department, will begin tracing that. That's already happening in the cases we already have in the county and across the state. So if the more kids mix together, the harder it is for them to trace. And if we cohort to the best of our ability, knowing that that's not a perfect answer, but it is a tool in the toolkit, then the health department may have means to not shut that entire school down. It can isolate the assessment of who might have been impacted to a fewer number of individuals, which may mean a classroom or a portion of the building needs to be excluded while it's cleaned and folks are assessed through the health department, rather than mixing kids constantly and then making that more difficult. So I talked about cohorting in classrooms, assigned seats on buses, rotating through recess. Lunch is another area. So kids may rotate through the cafeteria. They may grab their lunch and go back to their classroom, or they may rotate on certain days to be able to eat in the cafeteria. Some of this comes down to the size of our buildings and the facilities. So if we can accommodate larger groups, even if they were to go to a cafeteria to eat, they may be assigned seats based on their class or their group. Um, I recognize, and we all do, schools are schools. And our assessment is to fully comply with the CDC guidance is not feasible. And I think most people that remember school already intuitively knew that. So we have to find ways to at least give our health department the best possible chance to trace any incidences that they can. So that's what that looks like. And our elementary and high school teams are already evaluating what parts of the day in a typical school would you have a lot of kids mixed together. And then between now and the start of school, we'll determine the most feasible ways to cohort. Maximizing distance as feasible. Again, strict definitions by CDC are not feasible in a school. But where we can spread kids out, we would and are. So, for example, band, choir, some of these groups that have a lot of things going on, they're already pushing chairs as far apart as possible. We just in every scenario you try to maximize distance, and we know that can only be done to certain feasible extent. Avoiding large groups where possible. Again, we will try to figure out where do we have a lot of kids congregating on a typical school day, and then how would we reduce that? So, for instance, when kids come to school, a lot of times at the secondary level, they'll hang out until the bell rings. Well, we may have to change our procedures to where kids go straight to the classroom, or divide up the building so by cohort groups, so there's smaller numbers in a given area. This is a continuum here. There's no black and white answer. At least it describes for you what would we be doing differently. And lastly, allow masks and support those who do. It's clear in our survey data, and it's been consistent in the reports I've seen from other districts and states. There's too significant a large number of parents who are not going to permit that. So masks are allowable. They're not mandated, but those who choose to wear them should be supported in doing that. So these are the 8 ways we see reopening. These are the mitigations, and the subsequent slides go into even greater detail. So everyone who will have this presentation on our website on Tuesday, June 16th, can go through and look in detail on how we're managing this, how we would anticipate managing this. To be fair to our schools, we've only had state guidance 10 days at the time of this presentation, 10 days. So we didn't set on the information, we're communicating early, and we're describing what this would look like. But to be fair, they've only had the guidance 10 days. So we have the summer month to begin preparing even better procedures, processes, and approaches. But to be fair, they need time to do that. So I'm not going to read word for word on this. Folks can, but even getting into details, and we have like ventilation systems. We're already ordering better filters for our air circulation. For the guidance from CDC to say open up windows where you can. Well, we have schools that you can't open windows. So that's not feasible. So what do? We look for improved ventilation systems, improved filters. This is just an example of how detailed we're trying to get to mitigate risk where we can do it. So lots of cleaning, lots of prevention, lots of hygiene. Screening, I talked about that self-screening. So we will provide educational material on our website, mailed to parents, you name it, employees as well, on what are the symptoms and what do we do when we have them. And the key logic here is if a person is sick, they should not come to school until they're well. And we'll talk about what the health departments define that as. And then clearly providing virtual options for students who are sick. We recognize that there are vulnerable kids, and we've got to take care of them, and employees as well. So virtual options are going to be provided. Again, school-based 100% temperature screening is not feasible and not reliable in a school setting based on advice from health officials. So exclusion, being excluded from school for health reasons is not new. That's been part of schools since all of us have been in schools. Particularly in a pandemic, the health department has a good deal of authority on exclusion, and these are the symptoms. And we'll educate everyone to be monitoring themselves and their families for these symptoms and not coming to school. And you have them, and then reporting your absence for these reasons like we do every year. When parents have sick kids, we call the school, we let them know. And that honest communication, no stigma. There's nothing shameful about doing the correct thing, making sure people are comfortable communicating with us, us with them, with the health department, to exclude folks who are not well from coming to school until they can. So returning to school after exclusion, this is straight out of the health department via CDC. So there's a certain period of time where people are not going to be able to come in. So we're already working to provide online support for kids to work on their assignments, to be helped by someone until they can come back. We've had digital products like Edmentum, Study Island, you name it. Parents are aware of them. We've had them for years. We have received federal dollars to help us provide more of that, because you can imagine that if folks are sick, and it may not even be COVID, it could just be the flu, they're going to have symptoms similar to that. So at any given moment, kids and adults may not be able to be in the building. And what we're working on this summer is making sure they're well taken care of until they can come back. So as far as COVID itself and testing positive, either symptomatic or asymptomatic, these are guidelines that are health department driven, not just our health department, but state health department. So again, this is the first time folks are looking at this. We'll have procedures, processes well communicated, but given that we only received the guidance 10 days ago, we need time to do that. We weren't going to sit around and wait until July and August to tell you what this was going to look like. We need to start that conversation early, even if it doesn't have the detail that everyone would want. There just needs to be time. Transportation, we see hand sanitizers on buses. We see assigned seating on buses. We certainly will allow anyone to wear a mask recovery and support those who do, but they will not be mandated. Lots of cleaning. We are even providing dollars through federal dollars that we're going to receive to help augment and support our custodial and bus drivers to do this task. So we realize it's going to require more, and that means money. And we're going to use the federal dollars to support that. So we may contract with cleaning services. We may buy new types of equipment. We may recognize that there may be, and it's highly likely, we're going to have to put more dollars into cleaning. And that's the way we're going to do it. And siblings will be seated together. This makes sense. And assigned seating. Again, why? So the health department has a better leg up, a better ability to trace. And if they can trace better, then we won't have to close down whole schools. We can deal with the problem rather than disrupting the whole process. That's the logic in it as best as we can get to it. New procedures for entering schools, lots of signage, maybe even tape in hallways to kind of separate kids as they move through the building the best we can. Um, Being willing to let kids enter through multiple points in the school. There's lots of doors, not necessarily bringing them all through one. Again, that's that logic of trying to break down large groups. So we have time to work on that, and we already have begun working on that. As far as lunch goes, we got some options there. We can certainly do grab and go, where they come to the cafeteria, get their meals, and go back to their classroom. We're also focused on thinking through how could we have lunch in the cafeterias as normal, but kids would sit in cohorts in the class they came with, and in assigned seating. And kids going through and using the same utensils to self-serve is probably not going to happen. So Chartwell's is a very large company with lots of thinking on this. They serve schools all over the country. They were already generating options to support this. And you can imagine what that might look like. Even if you go into a cafeteria now, all the kids go to the same ketchup pump. Probably not going to have that. So prepackaged items. So we've got smart people on that. My hope is to be able to feed kids in cafeterias, even if we have to rotate them through. But that is the assumption, is to figure out how do you cohort the best you can and take away those things that make no sense in this environment. So looking at giving kids scanning cards rather than having every student punch in a number, or keypads. Pre-COVID, not an issue. COVID, that's an issue. So we're trying to get down to those scanning cards. Most of us have gone to the fuel station and used the same scanning card, or the punch-in key system. So what do we do about that? Well, we get our fuel and we get back in the vehicle, and we take the hand sanitizer and clean our hands. So some of this is a lot. It's a lot of hygiene, really is. But we also look and say, can we at least try to create better options that align to those mitigations we're describing? We're looking, based on advice from health department, to turn off our water fountains. So I anticipate kids will be allowed to bring water bottles to school. And we are authorized to provide bottled water through our food service fund. So I'm describing to you how school will return, but I'm also describing how it will look different. And what we're trying to do is avoid the more extreme disruptions to the school. But we're probably all going to have to compromise the best we can to make that happen. So water bottles are in, water fountains are out, at least while we start the school year. And then we'll provide water as well. Large group gatherings. More of this happens at the high school than at the elementary, but even at the elementary, a lot of times kids would come to school. They might wait in the gym. We're going to have to divide that space up, manage cohorts the best we can. Probably look at procedures where we're not dropping kids off way early in the morning. We're going to have to work together on this to make schools reopen. Clearly at the high school level, working on challenges. Everyone of us knows that went to high school. You have large locker banks. Everybody jumps out at passing periods. We may have to create passing hallways, lanes. These are suggestions that have been given to us by the health department. We may have to change the way we do lockers. In the old days, it's like no one gets a backpack. Well, we may have to have backpacks for a while. It's possible. We just don't want to see large groups of kids at the locker bank. There's other possibilities. We could rearrange locker banks, not based on alphabetical order, but on cohorts. Not a perfect set of solutions there. Again, this is on a continuum of feasibility. What's feasible? And we need time for our schools to process that information. Lots of work to support kids, particularly on those who've missed out on school. Some held it together pretty well, some less so. Sometimes for reasons outside the kids' control. We did make a measure of grace on grades last year, recognizing we were all thrown into it in real time at the same time. it made sense to try to make sure our kids weren't penalized. Hard to sort that out. Tough decision. Decision was made. Going into the fall, grades mean grades. So we have the right support, we have the right options, and we all have the right experience now, and we can communicate. But grades mean grades. So when we come back, do not expect that we're going to have that measure of grace. Grades have to mean something. What was done before will not make sense to do again. We've got to get back to school. Now, attendance is another matter. I do not envision where it makes sense to have very tough, tight, and penalizing attendance policies. We've got to make sure people are comfortable knowing that if they're not well, they shouldn't come until they are, and following that health department guidance. So I don't think it makes sense to be highly penalizing families and kids who are trying to do the right things that we're asking them to do. Again, more on that later, but what we're trying here to do is describe this for you. Protecting vulnerable populations is a part of our values. We take care of each other. No one knows who will get this virus. It doesn't care how old you are or young. Regardless of who it affects, we need to take care of those who are affected. So we will maintain that 100% online option for families who do not want to send their kids back. And there are certain children who do have high risk health considerations, and we're working with those families. And in the month ahead, our special ed department's actually reaching out to each in turn personally. So that option will come. I envision close to our typical registration, late July, mid to late July, in that time frame. We'll give parents an ability to opt into that. You can imagine it'll require a form. It'll require a description of what the online programming will look like, which we're working on that. And then we have to know how many families are going to take this option so that we can adequately plan for it and ensure it has the resources it needs to take care of those kids and those families. So look for that to come this summer as we continue to plan. Employees in the same situation, not only will families be resurveyed with this presentation, a new family survey, so we can see where people's attitudes have changed or to get feedback from them. Employees will get that same type of survey. So we're taking care of our vulnerable employees as well. So this slide talks about, when a child, staff member, or visitor becomes sick at school, we have procedures being developed for that. So that's the kind of information that the health department's weighing in on a great deal, so that if we do have a child, a student, or visitor sick at school, we know how to sensibly and correctly deal with that and get them isolated, get the communication going with families in the health department. So very descriptive in these slides as far as actual procedures and processes. That's what we need time to do. I'll reiterate, we've only had the state guidance 10 days. Last night, the board, with the health department present, did authorize the ability to move forward on summer activities. So clearly, the larger decision about reopening schools is left to July 20th. That makes sense to let us all think together, prepare together, communicate together. But sports, that's ahead of schedule. So the state's authorized summer activities and sports to begin July 6th. That's ahead of July 20th. So we did act on that. So the reopening of our sports and summer activities are absolutely in alignment with the mitigation strategies that we have here. Smaller group of kids, obviously, a good way to test our procedures, a good way for all of us to sort of dip our toe in the water of how schools will look in the fall and learn together. But our assessment is based on low community spread. It is now permissible to reopen our sports and summer activities, and the procedures to do that are well established, as these subsequent slides show, from our athletic department, and those co-curriculars will follow that same process. Not going to read word for word for you, but you can take your time going through these slides if you're a parent. who wants to know more about how summer athletics and co-curricular activities will begin, you'll have that. And again, anything in this document that's got a hyperlink in blue can take you to further information. It's pretty obvious for any of us to go to work now, go shop, go out into the public. The whole economy is reopening, and that raises a lot of legal questions. We're no different than any small business. We have to be concerned about a legal review of what we're doing. I don't think that comes as a surprise to anyone. So our outside counsel, our attorneys have already began the work of creating the forms, the processes, all very much new legal territory here. So we've got, again, the right people looking at it, making sure we put it together. I think it's fair to point out, and common sense will tell us this, that you cannot eliminate all risk in this COVID-19 environment. We can do our best, families and schools, our community, our economy, but it cannot be completely eradicated until a medical solution is found. So I expect you'll probably see a waiver or release of liability, or at least an assumption of risk acknowledgement. We'll let the attorneys work on that. It's probably not much different than we do every year. So as parents, we always get the handbook, the student handbook, and we assign a piece of paper that says we got it, that we're aware of it, and that's what we have. So probably looking at something like that specifically to the COVID environment, mainly because it cannot be, if we're honest with each other, and we will be, there's no way to completely eradicate risk. We manage it. So I expect you'll see that coming late summer as we start schools back up. And as you can read for yourself, lots of legal considerations. Item 7 on this is an important one. So we'll have a process, a form, or an online registration for those who want to opt in and to this online instruction, this 100% option. So our assumption is most folks want to come back to school. I mean, that's what we got from the survey. But for those who are not ready to do it, or they have significant concerns about pre-existing health conditions for their child, or perhaps their own family, we need to provide that option. Item number 7 means we're going to do that. Some of this from the legal perspective may or may not be of particular interest to parents, but in the interest of transparency, we're putting as much information to you as we possibly can, even though we're only 10 days from the state guidance. We feel it's important to start this earlier, get ahead of it, start communicating. So contingency plan for moderate spread. If we move to a moderate spread, then we have to prepare contingencies. The state is not providing us a definition on what's low, minimum, or substantial spread. So not only do we have to determine how and when to reopen schools locally, but we also have to assess this, and that's primarily going to be assessed by the health department. And quite frankly, we're okay with our local communities being able to manage this. Local control means something. My opinion, it's best for us as a community to sort this out ourselves. But if we have to go to moderate, this is what it would look like. It'd be our last option. We don't want to go there. It's disruptive to families. It's disruptive to the education of our kids. It limits their opportunities, and we're just doing everything we can, including cohorting and these mitigation strategies. As disruptive as they are, they're better than this option, which is trying to go back at half. We're prepared to go there if we have to, but it's not what we're focused on. So we did look in our advisory about the different ways of doing it, described across the country, every other day, every other week. Elementaries come back, but high school kids don't. These models are out there. I mean, anyone with a search engine, Google, can find them. But our teachers were very clear to us in the advisory. If we have to go back at that hybrid model, they would prefer to have kids every other day so they could see them more often, keep continuity of education more than what these other options would provide. So that's what was looked at and considered, and that's where our teachers landed. What would it look like? It would look a lot like this every other day. with an ability for Group A and Group B to get that third day of instruction on an alternating week. So you see a pattern there in the colors. And we would not consider that unless by July we're assessing our county to be moderate. We do not assess that right at this time, and we don't really believe we're going to be in that moderate zone. But if we are, we at least have a plan, a basic plan on the shelf that we can go to and say, this is how we would do it. A sample calendar can be seen in that hyperlink on sample calendar. It shows you what it would look like if we had to start at September 2nd and not open on time and go to this 50%. It shows you every day which kids are in and which kids are out. We'd have to keep kids in the same family on the same group. That makes sense. The logistics involved in this and the disruption to families are very difficult. Which I think is helpful for us to know that. So when we say, hey, we've got to reopen at 100%, we've got to think through how we cohort, how we clean, and how we do hygiene, how we do screening. I know in my previous slides, I know that shows that's a challenge. It's probably less of a challenge than this one because all those things would still be in play. Plus, we would only be back at 50%. Why did we consider that AB group 50% occupation? At least that contingency means we can at least maximize the number of times the kids are in school the best we can. Every other day allows students to see their teachers more frequently and keeps continuity. It does reduce the number of kids on buses and schools by 50%, which inherently means fewer kids are interacting. It provides predictability for childcare. It does not solve it, but at least people can see if my family's Group A, I know how to plan for childcare. And the days students are not in the classroom will be spent completing assignments and preparing for the next school day when they do come back. And we put some supports in there to help those kids while they weren't there. So that describes to you what our contingency plan would look like. I reiterate, it's not our focus. Our focus is return. And then obviously our virtual option is going to be present no matter what we do. So we are working with the partners we have in the digital curriculum. We've had them for years: Study Island, Waterford, Edmentum. Some of us remember that as Plato. It was credit recovery. We have a lot of tools in the toolkit, but I want to make sure that we think through how to we have good human interaction. A J Schools teacher. It's not just a computer and you log in. You've got a J Schools teacher supporting kids as they move through this for those families who are not ready to come back. So rather than some third-party company that you don't know, who probably makes a lot of claims, at least in this option, they're our people, our teachers, your neighbors, people that you know and can trust to help kids through it. So that's the way we're looking at it, and that's what we're planning for on that. And then the amount of planning that is necessary is pretty significant. So this describes each of those areas that we're focusing on. And I think I probably touched a lot of these planning areas in this presentation. Fiscal impacts, I'm expecting that we're going to get reductions in state funding. I think it's logical. It's a matter of time. I'm hoping they're minimal, but there's no way that we could see the state's revenue drop and not expect that to affect schools. So we're preparing for that. We have to be thoughtful about what we're spending on, what we're not, and being much more conservative in the way we fund, because that's a reality that we're going to have to expect. Obviously, substitute teachers, making everyone involved in our schools be fully aware of the plan, properly trained. All that is going to be in play. So that gives you the kind of categories we're considering and using. And it's clear, I know there are 1,001 things people want to know more about that they felt like they weren't addressed here. And when the survey you're going to get on Tuesday, June 16th, will resurvey parents. It'll have open-ended questions where you can say, hey, I want to know more about this, or I didn't see much on that. Based on what parents tell us, that'll help us plan. And that's that honest, transparent communication that says if this is important to parents, it needs to be important to us. And for parents, they need to have an adequate description of what we're thinking in order for them to make an informed decision, or at least provide us answers to the survey. So we're going to use that we've already used it. This presentation is evidence how we use it. Parents' voices matter. And that second survey is going to allow us to see what new things we need to be thinking about and what you want to know more about. But 10 days since the guidance, we're beginning this conversation. So we're not sitting back and waiting. We're getting ahead of it like we said we would do in May. So with that, this will conclude the presentation. The surveys will be sent through Skyward accounts. We'll call parents and let them know that it's there in their Skyward account. They can call us if they can't access it or if they can't get to a computer. But we're going to make sure everyone has it. It'll be open for a week so folks can communicate with their families, talk among themselves, process this information. And for a full week, parents can start weighing in, which will very much help us prepare over the next month to 2 months ahead of us. And I thank you for your patience and your support of our schools as we go through a very difficult time. But we will come out well. We have to this point. It's in every attribute of our county to get that done, which we've all demonstrated together. Thank you.